a payoff. God's eternal love. Truth is, I wanted to be a yeshiva boy. I wanted to study those ancient Hebrew texts day and night. Here, is this better? I forgot to turn on that. I wanted to study those ancient Hebrew texts day and night. The one with God always hovering between the lines. The one thing I never articulated, but I also wanted, had something to do with the enormous homoerotic appeal that happens in those religious, gender-divided communities. The way the Hasidic men danced arm in arm and even kissed one another, while the women huddle in each other's personal space on the sidelines and whisper in one another's ears. So I joined them. I had an arranged marriage and forbidden birth control. I had 7 children in 10 years' time. Needless to say, my mother was beside herself. It was an indoor, insular life, a bubble that I went into, and the rest of the world, you out there, became muted like cardboard cutouts. A covered life, a quiet life, and unfortunately rather peppered with erotic lesbian dreams. Back when I was writing Uncovered, I went away to a writer's retreat for women and went to dinner the first night and sat down next to Gloria Steinem. I took one look at Gloria and dropped my jaw. I thought, no wonder I've been struggling so deeply in finding the language to write my story. I became a covered woman before an era, in the early 70s, before the language of feminism seeped into our entire culture, regardless of your political or religious stand. The language is there in your life, in the media around you, and I was not part of that. I realized that was the language that I needed to understand my story. We became friends. She named my book Uncovered. It's a woman's coming-of-age or story from within ultra-Orthodoxy, in middle age. The journey, as is very common, delayed by the demands of religion and children. It's a love story, and then comes freedom. There's a lot more to this, and you'll see. I hope you'll buy the book. I hope you'll understand that I stand, I think, in my book as the typical mid-continent American girl. Or so I thought. But I want to add here, too, that all 4 of my grandparents were refugees. 2 of them came as children. But that legacy, that whisper, that sound through the generations in my family of migration, of cultural identity, that it was forced upon us in a negative way, but still very, very deeply embraced. That sense that we were isolated because there were so few of us, and we only had each other, and that sense that we had lost something whispered through the generations. My parents were born here. I was like an Andrew Cohen, like born to be an Andrew Cohen, without knowledge of our background, our religious tradition, without understanding of what we had left, but with a sense of something that had been lost. And deep within my psyche, I believe that when I first saw the old guard Hasidim, ultra-Orthodox dancing, something inside me went, I recognize that. Something inside me said, I have lost something, and now I've found it. Which was unfortunate, I think. For me, it was a stumbling point. That's why I was fascinated with Ruvi Namdar's scene, because I felt that Andrew Cohen had internalized exactly what I had encountered externally. And both me and Andrew Cohen, each in our own way, fell prey to that. Now, I want to point out how huge it is for us today that the media, our world, is filled. I'm speaking now in terms of gender. The media is filled with language, varieties of language, and varieties of prototypes for varieties of gender and sexuality. Because when I came of age, The word gender wasn't widely used. The word gay or any of its various synonyms were epithets. They were words that were whispered. They were not openly part of the cultural language. And I lacked language for myself. This is very essential. I was a girl moving forward intuitively without language that might have pointed me to understanding myself. No awareness of being outside of the mainstream because I didn't have and did not seek a label for feelings that were perfectly normal. We label what we term different. We label what we feel is an aberration. I didn't feel like an aberration. This is just how I felt. So I didn't understand that I was not going to fit into this society. This shows how young I was. That I was not going to fit into the Hasidic society that was so appealing to me. Lacking that language sent me straight into the binary Hasidic world. I note this because many people within the ultra-Orthodox world today who are not heterosexual labor under the same lack of language, the same inability even to understand themselves, and therefore to understand why they feel they don't belong and don't fit. And they internalize the rejection. They feel like they themselves are at fault. They are largely cut off from media and for that basic language that we now take utterly for granted until they find themselves thrust into conflict with their environment and spit out. Those that survive into an honest life usually do so because they access the internet, forbidden within many of those communities, and they find groups, secret groups, taboo groups, and find others speaking the language. That's how you gain language, by associating with a society, and then you absorb that manner of speaking and manner of thought. They find basically a community, a country online, and they begin to understand themselves. Although every aspect of our religious world was defined by that masculine/feminine binary, personally I never understood it. What does masculine even mean? To me, any attempt to define the word rings of stereotype. For example, if a large, strong, I'm using a man as an example, it could just as well be a woman, a large, strong, gruff man who exhibits tenderness for a child, or delicacy for a flower, or with a paintbrush. Can those not be also close and dear and central aspects of his identity and being? Are they less so because somebody has termed them feminine? But they're not feminine if they're part of this man. So, or if he's moved to tears by beautiful music, is he less masculine because of it? I never understood the binary. I never understood the assignment of gendered terms to human traits. But then part of that is me, because I'm a gender fluid person. When I sleep at night, when I dream, probably 50% of the time I dream that I'm male, and the other time female. To me, just in terms of the psyche, I don't understand where one ends and the other begins. To me, I'm all and both and neither. And this has nothing to do with my physical wiring or who I'm attracted to, because I'm solely and utterly and completely a lesbian. I can promise you that, because I tried to change that for many years and it was never going to change. If I were that man, I would insist that those qualities as well were part of my manhood. And the same goes for women. I just a note that I have this weird problem with pronouns that unconsciously I invert or trade them, and I never ever can hear myself when I do it. So I might be talking to my wife about somebody I saw yesterday, a woman, and I'd say he, and I'd not hear myself, and keep talking, and she'd go she, and I'm like, what? You said he, it's she. And even though she stopped me, seconds afterwards, I can never roll the tape back and hear that I did that, because to me it's irrelevant. It's interchangeable almost. But back then, this fluidity of gender was so deep in my psyche, so raw and baseline and unarticulated, that I couldn't begin to parse its meaning. I naturally wanted both sides of the binary Hasidic experience. I was attracted deeply to that rustling, feminine lighting of the group lighting of the Sabbath candles, the sense that women, like God, can create a day because the lighting of the candles literally creates the Sabbath, like God. And I was equally attracted to the sweating men, arm in arm, in ecstatic dance as prayer. I thought I could have it all. Ironically, the fluidity of my gender heightened the appeal. And then there's the issue of identity and how identity interacts with gendered roles. I'd never seen a reason to exclusively identify with my male or female peers, but this was at least partially responsible for my loneliness. And so my question, who am I, that any adolescent asked, was that much more intense for me. And here was a group that said, we will tell you who you are. You are a woman with a capital W. That's the title of a role. And the role has very specific dress and behavior. It's a bulleted list. Here's our religious law. Follow it and you will fully be a woman. Well, I had never quite understood how to fully be a woman or completely understand what that meant, which had made me feel very at odds, particularly in high school. And so that was a relief. Ultimately, they addressed this unspoken question. They gave me a clear label. Besides, I was an adolescent, not quite grown up. Calling me a woman said I was an adult. It was a compliment. Although the rigid Hasidic definition of womanhood drew me with relief into the fold, it was the ecstatic spirit of the men's spiritual life that most exemplified Hasidic life as a whole, which had the deepest pull. And since I related to them just as naturally, at first I didn't see the barriers. I dreamt of immersing in that heady study and group prayer. And backed right into my role. Because there was the day that the rabbi sat me down and said, for you to achieve spiritually what a man of prayer achieves, the way you achieve it is by marrying and having children. This is your spiritual role in life. This is your spiritual accomplishment. I would find myself walled off quite literally from the experiences that I had originally sought. Behind the wall, behind the partition in the synagogue that separates the men from the women, where the women must pray at a whisper. So yes, lacking language for myself, Orthodoxy gave me a definition, a clear label, and a place where I felt I could belong, and a definition of that, who am I? But only as long as I followed the rules. Just trim those little corners of yourself and you'll fit right in the box. Those little corners can be stubborn. And then there was that homoerotic quality of the community. I found the intimacy of the gatherings, their expression of same-sex love, pure and beautiful, and sadly, ironically, freeing. It wasn't long before I was swept along by that huge old current of ancient Jewish tradition and sameness, the quietness, the stability, the consistency of a religious community where everyone at least aspires to be the same. In those communities, peer pressure, as I said before, and gossip had epic and very, very serious power, serving to protect the uniqueness of the community by keeping you in line. Resist and you're a threat to the very definition of the whole. You learn very quickly to hide your differences. I was matched with a young boy after one date during which we were allowed to meet but not touch at 18. A week after my 19th birthday was our wedding. Forbidden birth control, as I said, that my children were born in 10 years. As a wife and young mother, they were my world. I was swept into that and utterly in love with that. I worked hard to fit in because I felt constantly binary sense of gender in the community, that black and white sense of identity. I knew the dangers, and so I wanted my children to fit so they would never be hurt. I worked very hard to build them into religious little children. And this I want to say is that that's very often the role of the mother. It is the role of the mother in society to socialize the little animals that we are as children, to cut off the little corners, to teach you to behave and not be impulsive, to think before you speak, to speak appropriately, to sit up straight, to be clean, to dress well, so that the world will be kind to you and not hurt you, but also so that you will be a building block of society. That's a mother's role, and it's very, very much a mother's role within a religious society. The mothers, the people who are silenced, the people who are covered, become the most vocal voice of the religion to perpetuate it. As my constructed identity, the person I became in Hasidic world, solidified, the cognitive dissonance within, the conflict inside of me grew along with that. Over time, insomnia, panic attacks in my sleep, all of which disappeared after I took back my life. I've been told that faith seems masculine in my writing. Perhaps it is so, but I don't see that as specific to me, since the Hasidic language of faith is so deeply masculine. That's a loss, isn't it, for all of us, that when faith takes on a very specifically masculine voice, particularly for the women. Not to mention the examples of masculine appropriation of the feminine throughout the Jewish religion, in the same way that God's feminine presence, the fabled Shekhinah, is folded into a God that we address as Him. I think here about the circumcision ritual, the ritual of circumcising a Jewish male. If you picture picture this. The child is born. On his 8th day, there's a ritual in the synagogue in which the women either stand at the back or in another room or don't attend at all. And yet the spiritual tradition says that the Jewish soul enters the child not at birth, but at the point of circumcision. In other words, that's when the child is born. When the father, not the mother, bears the child, the father bears the child into the community. And when the rabbi and the ritual circumciser together make this permanent mark in the most intimate place of that child's flesh, that's when that child is first given a name. That's when he is named and comes into existence into the community. The father bears the child, and here the child is born. The mother isn't present. And yet, although it is true that in becoming Hasidic, read stereotypically female, that bulleted list, I force a whole vital portion of myself underground. I believe that repression also saved me, since eventually that repression, discomfort, is what drove me secretly and at great potential loss to myself into secret forays into literature, reading secular books, all hidden, writing, all hidden, poetry, and ultimately questioning my faith, that led me to look for my lost self and find it in books, a place where I felt I might be. As I gradually exchanged the Hasidic woman for the real me, I was shocked, though, to find my faith waning. The more I felt myself, the more my faith seemed to be fading away. Her faith waning, I should say, at the same rate that I was becoming real. And I grieved that. I wanted to know if it was possible to find a place for myself within my culture, within my religion, within this part of identity that I define. And I'm going to read you a tiny piece from my book. This is very late in the book. Late enough that I dared to travel to another state and meet the head of a gay and lesbian synagogue. This was extraordinarily forbidden in the world that I lived in, and could get me divorce, loss of support, loss of contact with my children, many things. And I met them. The rabbi of the community introduced me to a friend, a woman named Rachel Adler, who I didn't know is a incredible scholar and was one of the first-tier seminal writers of feminist literature in Judaism, and took a scholarly feminist approach to liturgy and Orthodox Jewish law in an attempt to reinterpret and own, in a way that, in a sense, reconcile with our old texts and religion. But I didn't know who I was meeting. Rabbi Lisa introduces me to Adler, so it's almost like my early Gloria Steinem. I keep running into these women. Rabbi Lisa introduces me to Adler, a small middle-aged woman with a great smile. They're friends and neighbors. And the next day, I find myself Rachel Adler's guest at her synagogue, a liberal congregation with no partition. Rachel wraps herself in a large Hasidic-style men's prayer shawl, cream wool with black stripes hanging to her calves. The sight is absolutely startling. To me, the garment is reserved for men, and so her putting on the talit prayer shawl, it seems an act of utter rebellion. But then it's anachronist to me, I think, that so many Jewish women assert themselves by appropriating a male attire. And I asked, why don't they do something uniquely feminine? Then Rachel takes off the shawl and puts it around my shoulders. She does it in friendship, in welcome, to say, you are a woman with a voice here, this place where women have never been allowed to speak. Intuitively, as I've seen men perform around me for now nearly 30 years, as I've watched them through the lattice screen, I pull the front edge of the shawl forward over my head and face until I am inside a woolen tent. I cover my draped arms in front of my chest, and I whisper the blessing, the same that I taught my boys to say each day when they put on their miniature prayer shawls. I'm astonished to find myself then inside a quiet cloth chamber of my people. Light filters through, diffused. Vague, swaying shadows. The sound of my breath. Time slows. I hear chanting muted through the hanging cloth. It's a cloth cathedral, resonant with generations of human entreaty. And this is when I understand. It's not that Jewish women want to appropriate male attire. It's that gender shouldn't have anything to do with expressing human need. There's more, but I'm going to stop there. I knew that once I took that step, because what happens after this is that Rachel had arranged for this, and I didn't know. I thought it was spontaneous, but as that prayer service progressed, they moved to do the weekly reading of the Torah portion, which they read part of the Bible in Hebrew each week, so in a cycle, so that in the course of a year they cover the entire thing. And when that's done in the synagogue, they call different congregants up to say a blessing as they read every few sentences. It's an honor to make them like part of this communal ownership of this foundation text. And those people that are called up are always male, but not in this congregation. And so I was sitting there next to her. I had moved the shawl back around my shoulders, very shaken by that. And they called my name. And I looked at her in just terror. Just terror. I was deeply socialized to be at the back, behind the partition, never to speak. Only the men were in the front, leading, acting, leading the community, leading the prayers. The prayers are the voice of the community, and they called my name. So I just said to her, come with me. Because I knew I was going to do this, I forced myself to stand up and walk to the front. When I walked to the front, the reader opened the scroll and pointed to the few lines over which I was going to pronounce the blessing that I had only said when teaching my sons. And I looked in, but I can read biblical Hebrew. And it was the lines in the text in which Moses is approached. The Jewish people are in the desert, and these group of women, sisters, come to Moses. And they say, our father died, And his name was Zelat Chad. Our father died, and he left no son. Shall we then not be allowed to inherit among our people? And God inspires Moses to say, yes, in this case, you will inherit your father's portion. And this is the portion that was going to be read in my name. And I thought it was utter chance. I only found out years later that Rachel had chosen those lines and arranged for them to call me. I had no clue. I was angry in a way because I thought I had already decided there's no God. So what do I do with this consequence, with this utter, with this act of chance that this happened to me? But I read them, and then I pronounced the blessing before the congregation. They read the lines. I went back down to my seat, and as I went to my seat, the entire congregation stood and uttered the line that is normally said to a man when he comes down from the platform, to bless the reading. They say Yashar Kochech, Yashar Kochech, Yashar Koach, Yashar Koach. They say to a man, meaning you are upright and strong, or upright is your strength. But they were saying it in the feminine form to me. All the congregation, Yashar Kochech, they were telling me that your feminine strength is upright. I pulled the shawl over the front of my face and cried. Thus began taking back my life. I put the wig and the scarf and the long clothes back on, and I flew home. I went grocery shopping. I cooked the Sabbath meal. I served my family and sat at the table ready to serve with my husband, sitting at the head in his long black coat, his beard and hat, our children in their Sabbath best around the table. And in that setting, I told my family that I had put my forbidden woman's hands on the actual Torah scroll, because women are not allowed to eat so much as touch it, before the congregation, that I had sung out the blessings out loud, another sin, rather than sitting in silence in the back. I told them that I had prayed aloud among men while wearing a prayer shawl. I tried to describe the other religious families that had dared showed up, men in beards and women in scarves and modest dress. I was met with a line of eyes. If my children's lives were built in little cubicles, I was dissolving all of those walls in their lives. And only then I began to understand what I'd done, understood the beginning of the destruction that they were witnessing, and a way for us all. A lot of non-heterosexuals actually stay on in the Hasidic world. And as you can see, I did not only leave because I was a lesbian. I left because I'm an artist, because I'm a woman, because I had to have a voice, because my faith was changing, because I was reading and thinking for myself, and for 1,000 other reasons. Even for those non-heterosexual people who are headed out of the ultra-Orthodox community, there are many points on that path. Besides, we know to what extent the women are trained in self-sacrifice. So many never leave. The specter of loss can be too staggering. From my mother, I had learned how artistic expression is and must be spontaneous and, above all, uncensored. So I had a vital role model of a strong woman with an untethered voice. I had her still with me, that memory of the previous generations. I had a different memory as well that I'd forgotten. So I can't underscore enough how essential that was. How I remembered that she had handed me the language long before. She was an artist and an independent person. I had ignored the language. And so those who do not have that role model, who do not have that language, I don't have ever questioned why they remain within the fold. Today, as an openly gay woman, I'm, as a matter of fact, about my gender, you see, and my sexuality as any heterosexual is. And it's about as open to conversation. It's not exactly a conversation opener, right? But I shake my head at why that had to be so hard-earned. Becoming an artist also unsocialized me, and that made it impossible for me to stay in a rule-bound society. It seems I followed in becoming a writer, I followed a perfect guide called How to Become a Subversive. Writers are dangerous. To be an artist, to be a writer, to be creative, one must say what one says, one must create what one must create without checking to see if it's acceptable or following the rules first. My memoir, Uncovered, has been perceived by many in the Hasidic world as a threat. It's been unofficially banned in many places. I always wanted to write a banned book. It's also been wonderful hearing how much my book has been read as a result, specifically as a result of that. Wonderful hearing from the people that contact me in secret, who are sometimes frightened for very, very good reasons. It means the world to me. I had dreamed of covered women reading my book everywhere, their copies covered in brown paper, or they were keeping it under a blanket at night or hidden in bathrooms. Sometimes you write a book and find you become a voice that other people wish they had. Before I go, I want to add one thing about language, because this is all, as a writer, that's kind of my obsession. This is all about varieties of language fitting the varieties of gender and varieties of people in an infinite way, something that cannot happen in a gender-bound or rule-bound society. This is specifically about women. Many of us grew up and were formed as women with only one language to express faith or spirituality. For women, that's a language of gestures, not words, and a language of self-sacrifice. The way a woman shows that she loves God, or shows that she believes, or shows that she's devoted to tradition in her community is by not speaking and by covering herself. If that's the only language that these women have, then there's no question she will always turn to covering herself and silence in order to convey her religious feeling, and will accept that loss of self in the process. This will not change until women have a proactive language of prayer, a language of faith, a language of spirituality, a language of self, a language of hope that is hers and hers alone, that is not one of erasure and covering and self-sacrifice in the guise of modesty. Until then, I will always understand those young people who feel spiritual, and even if they come from secular backgrounds, the young women I've met in Istanbul, all over Istanbul, whose parents did not cover, and the women were walking around in hijab. I understand them. They're saying, this is me, this is my tradition, my background, my faith. What's wrong with that? And I want to say, nothing's wrong with it, sweetheart. Now let me express my hope that you can find also a language of words to express the same thing, a language of action and not just one of erasure. That's how I feel about the Jewish tradition and about any religious tradition that asks women to give up something vital in order to gain something vital. That's why my book is dedicated to my covered sisters everywhere. Thank you very much. I forgot to look at the time. Did I go way over? Are we good?
I think we have a few minutes for questions. If there are any.
Do you have any questions? Comments? Yes.
So you mentioned a little bit about the consequences you had.
About the what?
Like the consequences you had leaving
yes.
Your religion. And I was just wondering if you could touch on like the consequences you faced leaving your religion, and if you like maybe have amended them over time, like with your family and like with your friends that you live.
Well, first of all, I live within a bubble of community, and the entire community turned their back on me. So I lost all of my friends, all of my support system. I was completely alone in the world. And that's mild compared to what happens to many women in larger, like in New York, in larger, or in Israel, in larger communities. Because at least I could still see my children. My children were teenage. They ranged from 13 to 23 when I first left. So they were angry. They were very angry, but I was still mom. Over time, though, the relationship with some of them frayed very badly. When you're in a religious world like that, when things are very rule-bound, people get really good at compartmentalizing. One of my kids, for example, not all my kids remained within the fold, but one of those who did and lives in a large Hasidic community forced himself, after working through some of his anger, to accept me in his home privately. He would never meet my wife or step into my home. But privately, he was actually warm until my book came out. But all of a sudden, I had stepped into his public sphere, caused him embarrassment. That's the worst thing, right? You don't cause someone embarrassment and make them look less religious before the community as a whole. And he's completely cut himself off from me. All the others we've worked through. But I did have to create a whole new society for myself. Anything else? All right, yes.
Leah, I'm sorry I stepped in later, but I heard you speak a little bit about your experiences before. I wonder if coming into sort of the religious sphere, coming from a secular background, if you found yourself in a situation where you were sort of having to be sort of over enthusiastically very religious in your religious life, if that sort of the kind of if that had consequences in how your religious life was as you lived it, right? I mean, there are people, I guess, who were born into Hasidism who tried to find a space within it, right? But then if you come in, I think, from the outside, sometimes you want to prove that, you are up to the task.
Well, that's true of any homogeneous group. So any club you join or whatever, you work really hard to be accepted. So you want to be, more in than the in people. To prove that you really deserve that membership, and newcomers as well as converts were like the most zealous of the group and remain that way. They work really hard at repressing their past, at repressing their differences, and it's a little frightened usually too.
Which is typical for converts.
Yes, yeah, that's what I meant. It's true of converts as well.
Yeah.
Thank you all very, very much.